Hey, Vintage family, welcome back to our midweek teaching set. We're in the book of Colossians and we're working through systematically, just verse by verse. I want to dive back into really finish the last piece of this study that we've been looking at, really where Paul will start in chapter 3, and he says, since you've been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven. So he calls this young Colossian church, in response to the grace of God that they've received, in response to the work of the cross that's in their lives, in response to just the incredible input of Jesus, that they are now to live in a way where their eyes are fixed on Him. And I want to remind us of that because I think the basics of our Christian life, the basics of what we do is that simple. If you and I will daily make the choice to set our sights on the realities of heaven. And really, what does Paul mean by that? He means Jesus. That the reality of the cosmos is centered around this one man, Jesus. He is the center of everything. He's central to everything. He's preeminent, would be the theological term. If we would just make that decision, this is what Paul's saying to them. If you just make that decision, all these other things are going to begin to transpire in your life. And so he goes through a list of what they are to do and what they are to let go of. And then we get in here to the last part of chapter 3, and Paul talks about let the words of Christ and all their richness live in your hearts and make you wise. And he begins to give culture. Culture, I want to remind us, is anything that we condone and anything that we create. So you and I are constantly creating a culture around ourselves. Sometimes we're creating negative culture because of the behavior patterns we're choosing. And sometimes, to Paul's point, we can create an incredible kingdom culture around ourselves. We can create that environment of Christ, that environment of Jesus. I actually think that there's a really important principle, and that is when I'm living the culture that he has said, the natural reality is it invites him to hang out with me. It invites him to be with me, be around me. So we've looked at several of these in our last few sessions, and the last one we were finishing up was the way that healthy kingdom culture is revealed in our families. Really, the principle is, if I'm governed by Jesus, it should look like it in my home. And we looked at that with the husband-wife relationship and the child relationship. This last one that I want to look at, where Paul will say, you slaves must obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they're watching you. Obey them willingly because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Work hard and cheerfully at whatever you do, as though you are working for the Lord rather than people. Remember, the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and the master you are serving is Christ. I want to dive into a conversation about work, because I think this healthy kingdom culture that's around us will and should reveal itself in our work culture. There's not a separation between our homes and our church life and our work life. I know that in North America there is a compartmentalized concept that says I can be who I need to be in the marketplace, I can be aggressive, maybe even ugly, because that's what it takes to do business. But in my church world, I'm going to be sweet and gentle, maybe quiet. In my home, I'm going to be maybe stoic, or maybe I'm loud. All of that needs to be put away. That is not who we are called to be. We are integrated people, mind, body, spirit. The Holy Spirit wants to govern all of those things. So everything we do and say is to be a representative of Jesus. I would actually say it this way. As a believer, everything we do and say is a representative of Jesus, which is a concern for me because I begin to wonder, am I representing him well all the time? So Paul's invitation to this Colossian culture is, I want you to be careful, to be diligent with how you represent Jesus. And so this workplace relationship is not exempt. If we look at the context, and I always want to be careful to look at context before we look at application. In context, the slave and slave master language is really difficult for us to directly apply. Paul is speaking to what was at the time a legal relationship where a person could actually be purchased and owned by another person. And we don't live in a culture where that's a common idea. In fact, we actually live in a culture where that very real idea has been abolished and it's been outlawed. So our conversations with these words now, when we think about slavery, we're speaking about something that's different than even what Paul was seeing. We're speaking about the illegal control of another's life. So that's not what Paul was addressing here. He was not addressing illegal control. He was actually addressing a legal idea. That doesn't make it right, but I want us to remember Paul's addressing a first century culture where this type of slavery wasn't illegal. In fact, it was pretty normal. I still think that type of slavery and legal ownership is wrong, and I think the world at large has decided on that as well. But I just want to dig into how Paul teaches this young Colossian church, just in this moment. Because they were people in this socioeconomic reality. Without question, some of them in this very church were probably slaves owned by somebody else. And the way Paul addresses it is interesting to me. He actually ignores the reality of slavery. Instead, he speaks directly to the character and the behavior of those within the culture. He doesn't mean by that slavery is okay, that it's morally all right. It just means that it was the cultural norm, and Paul's doing something that I think we need to learn how to do. There are times when we see things in our culture that probably bother us, they probably offend our spirit. Everything in us probably says, oh, that's not right, we got to fix that. Paul's leaving room for the Holy Spirit to bring personal conviction to his church first, and then his church is going to lead the way in the culture to bring reform. That's what we see happen through history. But Paul's clear statements here are about obedience and honor and integrity. I love this statement. He calls slaves to work hard and cheerfully at whatever is required. The word phrase means to come under and conform with singleness of heart and devotion. And Paul's calling slaves to dig in and work hard, being joyful and actually working to please their respective masters. I want you to consider that Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, calls these slaves to smile and work hard and keep their eyes on Jesus. His invitation is that they should remember that they work on earth with a king in heaven that is going to reward them for their honor and their effort. And I love that phrase. The master you are serving is Christ. And with this simple statement, Paul's reminding them that the Lord is with them in their station, and he's going to honor how they handle themselves. I want you to think about that for a second. Paul doesn't say, hey, the Lord's going to emancipate you from this moment. He just says, I want you to know the Lord is with you. And I think some of us would do really well to remember there isn't always a promise that the Lord's going to remove us from our difficulty, but there is a promise that he will be with us in our difficulty. And the way we handle ourselves in said difficulty gives us the opportunity for reward. I want to push pause there. That's the context side. We'll come back in our next session and we're going to look at how we can apply that, because I think it's incredibly relevant to our lives in the marketplace. Love you guys.